Aldrics Final Peace. London, 1919. Clara Ainsworth inherited an antique mirror from her brother, Private Thomas Ainsworth. One night, she glanced into it and saw not her reflection, but a muddy trench, eerily familiar to descriptions of Passchendaele. Chapter 1. The Inheritance of Shadows. The solicitor's office smelled of old paper and regret, a fitting aroma, Clara thought, for the occasion. Mr. Henderson, a man whose starched collar seemed to perpetually threaten strangulation, cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the heavy silence. And finally, Mrs. Ainsworth, there is this. He slid a large, tissue-wrapped parcel across the mahogany desk. It was surprisingly heavy. Your brother, Private Thomas Ainsworth, specifically requested that this be delivered to you, should the unfortunate occur. Clara reached out, her fingers tracing the outline of the object beneath the thin paper. Unfortunate. Such a polite, inadequate word for the gaping hole that Thomas's death had ripped through her life. He'd been all she had left, the last ember of a family consumed by the inferno of war. Her father, a career soldier, lost at Mons. Her mother, withered by grief, gone only months later. And now Thomas, barely 20, swallowed by the mud of Passchendaele. Thank you, Mr. Henderson, she murmured, her voice catching. She managed a weak smile, the kind one offered to strangers in the face of unbearable sorrow. The journey home to her small, rented flat in Bloomsbury was a blur. The London streets, still celebrating the armistice, seemed a world away from the silent grief she carried. The cheers, the flags, the laughter, it all felt like a cruel mockery. How could they celebrate when so many were gone? When so many, like her, were left adrift in the wreckage? The flat was cold, despite the meager fire she'd built in the hearth. The silence, usually a comfort, now pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. She unwrapped the parcel, her hands trembling. Beneath the layers of tissue paper and burlap lay a mirror. Not a small, delicate hand mirror, but a large, ornate standing mirror, its frame intricately carved with scenes of intertwined roses and thorns. The wood was dark, almost black, and the glass itself seemed to shimmer with an unnatural depth. Clara ran a hand over the cool, smooth surface. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but also unsettling. It felt old. Older than Thomas, older than the war, older than anything she'd ever encountered. A faint, metallic scent, like dried blood and earth, clung to it. She positioned the mirror against the wall, opposite the window. The fading light of the late afternoon caught the glass, illuminating the room with a strange, amber glow. Clara stared at her reflection. Her face, framed by her dark, unfashionably short hair, was pale and drawn. Grief had etched lines around her eyes, lines that hadn't been there a year ago. She looked older than her 28 years. She sighed, turning away from the mirror. The weight of the day, the weight of her loss, settled upon her like a shroud. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to cry, to scream, to shatter the suffocating silence. But she didn't. She had learned, over the past 4 years, to swallow her grief, to bury it deep within her heart. There was no room for tears in a world at war, even a world that was supposedly at peace. Later, after a supper of cold bread and cheese, she had little appetite. These days Clara found herself drawn back to the mirror. The room was now bathed in the soft glow of a single oil lamp. The city outside was quiet, the revelry of the day having subsided into a weary hush. She stood before the mirror, studying her reflection again. The lamplight flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For a moment, she thought she saw something move in the glass, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. She blinked, shaking her head. It was just the light, she told herself. Just the shadows playing tricks on her tired eyes. But then she saw it again. A subtle shift in the reflection, a blurring of the edges. The room behind her seemed to recede, replaced by a hazy, indistinct image. Clara leaned closer, her breath catching in her throat. The image sharpened, resolving itself into something impossible. It was not her room reflected in the glass. It was a landscape of mud and desolation. A vast, cratered expanse of earth, scarred by trenches and shell holes. The sky above was a sickly, gray-green, the air thick with smoke and the stench of decay. It was a scene of utter devastation, a landscape straight from the nightmares that had haunted her sleep since Thomas had been sent to the front. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stumbled back, her heart pounding against her ribs. It couldn't be. It was just a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. She closed her eyes tightly, willing the image to disappear. When she opened them again, the image was still there. More vivid, more real. She could almost feel the damp chill of the air, hear the distant rumble of artillery fire. And then she saw him, a figure, clad in the muddy, tattered uniform of a British soldier, emerged from the swirling mist. He was young, his face gaunt and streaked with grime, but his eyes were familiar. They were Thomas's eyes. The same warm, brown eyes that had always held a spark of mischief, even in the darkest of times. He looked directly at her, his lips moving as if he were speaking. But she couldn't hear his words, only a faint, echoing whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the mirror itself. He raised a hand, a gesture of greeting? Or warning? Clara reached out, her fingers brushing the cold glass. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Is that really you?" The soldier in the mirror didn't answer. He just stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else. Something that looked like hope. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the image began to fade, the muddy landscape dissolving back into the reflection of her own, dimly lit room. Clara stood there, her hand still pressed against the glass, her mind reeling. What had she just seen? Was it a dream? A hallucination? Or something more? The metallic scent of the mirror seemed stronger now, filling the room with the ghostly smell of the battlefield. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that what she had seen was real. The mirror was not just a mirror. It was a window into another world, a world of war and death, a world where her brother, somehow, still existed. The chilling realization held her rooted to the spot, the silence of the flat now alive with 1,000 unspoken questions, 1,000 impossible hopes. Chapter 2. Whispers from the Trenches. Sleep eluded Clara that night. The image of Thomas, his face gaunt and muddy, his eyes pleading from the depths of the mirror, was seared into her mind. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside her window, sounded like the distant rumble of artillery fire. She tossed and turned, her mind a whirlwind of impossible questions and desperate hopes. Could it be real? Could the mirror truly be a portal to somewhere else? To the past? To the battlefield where Thomas had died? Or was it, as she had initially feared, a cruel trick of her grieving mind, a manifestation of her desperate longing to see her brother again? The dawn brought no answers, only a dull ache behind her eyes and a growing sense of unease. She made herself a pot of strong tea, the familiar ritual a small comfort in the face of the bewildering events of the previous night. She ate a piece of toast, forcing herself to swallow even though she had no appetite. She needed to be strong, to think clearly. As she sat at her small kitchen table, her gaze drifted towards the mirror, now shrouded in a sheet she had draped over it before finally succumbing to a fitful sleep. The very sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. She both dreaded and desperately wanted to look into it again. Finally, she could resist no longer. With trembling hands, she pulled the sheet away. The mirror stood there, silent and enigmatic, its dark wood gleaming in the morning light. For a long moment, she simply stared at her own reflection, searching for any sign of the strange vision she had seen the night before. Nothing. The room behind her was reflected perfectly, the familiar objects of her life, the worn armchair, the overflowing bookcase, the small, chipped vase of wilting flowers on the mantelpiece, all present and accounted for. It was just a mirror, a beautiful, antique mirror, but nothing more. Relief, tinged with disappointment, washed over her. Perhaps it had been a dream, after all. A particularly vivid and unsettling dream, but a dream nonetheless. She was about to turn away, to dismiss the whole experience as a product of her grief-stricken mind, when she saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the reflection. A subtle shift in the light. And then, slowly, the familiar image of her room began to fade, replaced by the same desolate landscape she had seen the night before. The mud, the trenches, the sickly green sky, it was all there, just as she remembered. And then he appeared. Thomas. Standing in the same muddy trench, his uniform even more tattered and stained than before. He looked tired, exhausted, but his eyes held the same spark of recognition, the same flicker of hope. He raised a hand, as if to greet her, and then he began to speak. This time, she could hear him, though his voice was faint and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. "Clara, can you hear me?" The words were barely a whisper, but they were clear enough. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Thomas? Yes, I can hear you. Where are you?" He smiled, a sad, weary smile that tore at her heart. "It's hard to explain. It's Passchendaele, but different." Passchendaele. The name sent a chill down her spine. The place where he had died. Or had he? Different? How? She asked, her voice trembling. He hesitated, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's like a memory. A repeating memory. We're stuck here. Fighting the same battle. Over and over again. Stuck. Repeating." The words made no sense, yet they filled her with a growing sense of dread. "But you died there," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I received the telegram, the official notification." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. I don't know, Clara. I don't understand it. All I know is I'm here. And I need your help." Her help? What could she possibly do? She was just a woman, alone in London, miles away from the horrors of the battlefield. How can I help you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer to the mirror, his face filling the frame. "There's something here. Something that's keeping us trapped. I think it's connected to the mirror. To this place." He gestured around him, to the muddy trench, the desolate landscape. "You need to find out what it is. You need to break the cycle." Break the cycle. The words echoed in her mind, a desperate plea from a world beyond her comprehension. She looked at her brother, his face so close, yet so impossibly far away. She knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that she had to help him. She had to do whatever it took to bring him home, even if it meant facing the horrors of a war that was supposed to be over. The desperation in his eyes mirrored the burgeoning resolve in her own. She had to try. She owed him that much, at least. Chapter 3. The Soldier in the Glass. The days that followed were a blur of frantic research and growing desperation. Clara spent hours in the British Library, poring over maps of the Western Front, casualty lists, and accounts of the Battle of Passchendaele. She learned about the horrific conditions, the staggering loss of life, the sheer, brutal futility of it all. The more she learned, the more the image of Thomas, trapped in that endless cycle of mud and death, haunted her. She tried to speak to others about the mirror, about Thomas, but she quickly realized the futility of that approach. The few friends she had left, those who hadn't been consumed by the war or its aftermath, looked at her with pity and concern. They saw a grieving woman, driven to madness by her loss. She learned to keep her secret to herself, to guard it jealously, lest she be dismissed as a lunatic. Every evening, she would return to her flat, draw the curtains, and light the oil lamp. And every evening, the mirror would reveal its secret world. Thomas would be there, waiting for her. Their conversations were brief, fragmented, often interrupted by the sounds of battle or the sudden disappearance of the image. But they were enough. Enough to keep her hope alive, enough to fuel her determination. She learned more about his existence. He was aware of the passage of time, but it was distorted, fragmented. He remembered his life before the war, his childhood with Clara, their parents, their home. But his memories were fading, becoming blurred and indistinct, like old photographs washed out by the rain. He was losing himself, piece by piece, to the endless cycle of the battle. "I'm forgetting things, Clara," he confessed one evening, his voice filled with despair. "Small things at first. The name of our dog the color of mother's eyes, but now it's getting worse. I'm afraid I'll forget you." His words struck her like a physical blow. The thought of Thomas forgetting her, of losing the last connection to her family, to her past, was unbearable. "No," she said fiercely, her voice trembling. "You won't forget me. I won't let you. I'll find a way to bring you back. I promise you." He smiled, a sad, fleeting smile. "You always were stubborn, Clara." She also learned about the others trapped with him. Other soldiers, British, Canadian, Australian, all caught in the same repeating nightmare. They were aware of their predicament, but they were powerless to change it. They were ghosts, trapped in a loop of endless suffering. One evening, as she was talking to Thomas, another soldier appeared behind him. He was tall and lean, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, simmering anger. He wore the uniform of an officer, though it was as muddy and tattered as Thomas's. "Who's that?" Clara asked, startled. Thomas glanced over his shoulder. "That's Captain Alistair Wakefield. He's been trying to figure this out, too. He thinks it's something to do with a German intelligence operation. Some kind of secret weapon." Captain Wakefield stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Clara. "You can see us?" he asked, his voice sharp and precise. "You can hear us?" Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "Yes. I'm Thomas's sister." He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "And you believe this mirror is the key?" I don't know," Clara admitted. "But it's the only connection I have to Thomas. It's the only hope." He nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Hope is a dangerous thing in this place, Mrs. Ainsworth. But it's all we have left." He paused, then added, "We believe there's a traitor. Someone working with the enemy, feeding them information. That's why this keeps happening. Someone wanted Passchendaele to be a slaughter." The accusation hung in the air, a chilling counterpoint to the ever-present gunfire. Clara felt a new layer of fear settle over her. It wasn't just a supernatural phenomenon, it was a conspiracy, a betrayal. And somehow, she was caught in the middle of it. The mirror was not just a window to the past, but a reflection of a deeper, darker truth. Chapter 4. A Promise Across Worlds. The revelation about a possible traitor added a new layer of urgency to Clara's quest. It wasn't just about saving Thomas, it was about uncovering a truth, a betrayal that had cost countless lives. She began to divide her time between the library and the War Office, seeking any information she could find about German intelligence operations during the war, specifically around Passchendaele. The War Office was a labyrinth of bureaucracy and suspicion. As a woman and a civilian, she was met with skepticism and outright hostility. But Clara was persistent, fueled by a determination that surprised even herself. She used her brother's name, his service record, anything she could to gain access to the files, the reports, the whispers that circulated within those hallowed halls. She discovered that Captain Wakefield's suspicions were not entirely unfounded. There had been rumors, persistent rumors, of a leak within British intelligence. A highly placed individual, code-named Nightingale, was suspected of passing information to the Germans. But the investigation had been inconclusive, hampered by the chaos of the war and the reluctance of those in power to admit to such a breach. One evening, as she was sharing her findings with Thomas and Captain Wakefield through the mirror, the captain said, "Nightingale. That's the key. Find out who Nightingale was, and you might find out why this is happening." "But how?" Clara asked, frustration creeping into her voice. "The files are incomplete, redacted, they're hiding something." "They always hide something," Wakefield said bitterly. "The truth is the first casualty of war." He paused, then added, "There was one man, Major Julian Thorne. He was in charge of the Nightingale investigation. He was close to the truth, I believe. But he was removed from his post. Disappeared. The word sent a shiver down Clara's spine. Where did he go? Wakefield shook his head. No one knows. Officially, he was reassigned to a less sensitive position. But I suspect he was silenced. Clara felt a surge of determination. She had to find Major Thorn. He might be the only one who could help her unravel the mystery of the mirror, the mystery of Nightingale, and the mystery of Thomas's endless battle. I'll find him, she said, her voice firm. I promise you, I'll find him. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and gratitude. Thank you, Clara. You're our only hope. That night, Clara dreamt of Major Thorn. She saw him, a tall, gaunt figure with haunted eyes, standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by files and maps. He was whispering something, a name Nightingale. She woke up with a start, her heart pounding. The dream had been so vivid, so real. She felt a sudden, overwhelming conviction that she was on the right track. The next day, she began her search for Major Thorn. She started with the War Office, but she quickly hit a dead end. No one seemed to know anything about him, or if they did, they weren't willing to talk. She tried the Military Records Office, the Veterans Associations, even the newspapers. Nothing. Days turned into weeks, and still, she found no trace of the elusive Major. She was beginning to lose hope, to fear that she had reached a dead end. But then one evening, as she was sitting in her flat, staring at the mirror, she noticed something she hadn't noticed before. On the back of the mirror, etched into the dark wood, was a small, almost invisible inscription. It was a name and an address. Julian Thorn, 12, Willow Creek Lane, Surrey. Clara stared at the inscription, her heart pounding. It was as if the mirror itself was guiding her, leading her towards the truth. A surge of renewed hope coursed through her. She had a lead, a real lead, and she wouldn't waste it. The address felt like a lifeline, a tangible connection to the answers she so desperately sought. Chapter 5. Echoes of Passchendaele. 12. Willow Creek Lane, Surrey, was a far cry from the bustling streets of London. The cottage was small, secluded, and almost swallowed by the overgrown garden that surrounded it. It had an air of neglect, of forgotten things, that mirrored the forgotten man Clara hoped to find within. She approached the front door with a mixture of trepidation and anticipation. The paint was peeling, the brass knocker tarnished, and the windows were dark and dusty. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and knocked. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She was about to turn away, convinced that the address was a dead end, when she heard a faint sound from within. A shuffling, scraping sound, followed by a muffled cough. She knocked again, and this time, a voice called out, weak and raspy. Who is it? My name is Clara Ainsworth, she called back. I'm looking for Major Julian Thorn. It's about my brother, Private Thomas Ainsworth. There was a long silence, then the sound of bolts being drawn back, and the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim light within. He was tall and thin, his face gaunt and lined. His eyes were indeed haunted, just as she had seen them in her dream. Major Thorn? She asked, her voice trembling. He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on her. Who are you? I told you, she said. I'm Clara Ainsworth. My brother, he's trapped. In Passchendaele. I believe you can help me. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. Then, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Come in, Mrs. Ainsworth. We have much to discuss. The cottage was dark and cluttered, filled with books, papers, and maps. The air smelled of dust and stale tobacco. Major Thorn led her to a small sitting room, where a single oil lamp cast a flickering glow. He motioned for her to sit in a worn armchair, while he settled himself opposite her. Now, he said, his voice still raspy, but with a hint of steel beneath the weariness. Tell me everything. About your brother. About Passchendaele. Clara took a deep breath and began to tell her story. She told him about the mirror, about Thomas, about Captain Wakefield, about the endless cycle of the battle. She told him about Nightingale, about the rumors of betrayal, about the investigation that had been abruptly halted. Major Thorne listened intently, his eyes never leaving her face. He asked questions, probing questions, that showed he understood more than she had initially anticipated. The mirror, he said when she had finished. It's a conduit, a link between two realities. But how? Clara asked.
Why?
He shook his head. I don't know the exact mechanism. But I know it's connected to Nightingale. To the trauma. The sheer, concentrated horror of that battle. It created a ripple. A tear in the fabric of reality. And Nightingale? Clara pressed. You were investigating him. You were close to the truth, weren't you? He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a deep sadness.
Yes, I was.
I had evidence. Proof. But they silenced me. They took everything. They destroyed my life. Who? Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Who was Nightingale? Major Thorne hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the window, as if he were looking out at something far away. Then, he turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Nightingale, he said, his voice low and steady, was someone very close to the top. Someone untouchable. Someone with the power to manipulate events, to control the flow of information, to betray his own country. He looked directly at Clara, his gaze intense. It was Lord Harrington, head of MI5. The name struck Clara like a thunderbolt. Lord Harrington. A pillar of the establishment, a respected figure, a war hero. It seemed impossible, and yet it made a terrible kind of sense. The power, the access, the ability to cover his tracks, but why? Clara asked, her voice trembling. Why would he do such a thing? Thorne shrugged, a gesture of helplessness.
Power. Greed.
Ideology. Who knows? The reasons are irrelevant. The consequences are what matter. He leaned forward, his voice urgent. You must be careful, Mrs. Ainsworth. You've stumbled onto something dangerous. Something they will do anything to protect. The sudden crash from behind the cottage made them both jump. Thorne's eyes widened, and he grabbed Clara's arm. They know, he whispered. They've found us. Chapter 6. The Letter and the Locket. The back door burst open, splintering wood and shattering glass. Two men, dressed in dark suits, their faces grim and determined, stormed into the cottage. They were not soldiers, they were something far more sinister. They were agents, the kind who operated in the shadows, the kind who made problems and people disappear. Major Thorne, one of the men said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. You've been a very naughty boy. Thorne stood up, his frail body trembling, but his eyes defiant. I won't let you silence me again, he said, his voice surprisingly strong. The agent smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. Oh, I think you will, Major. You see, we have leverage. He gestured to the other agent, who stepped forward, holding something in his hand. It was a small, silver locket, engraved with the initials E.T. Clara recognized it instantly. It was Thomas's locket, the one he always wore, the one that contained a miniature portrait of their mother. Where did you get that? Clara gasped, her hand flying to her chest. The agent smiled again. Let's just say we have ways of reaching into other worlds and influencing events. He tossed the locket to Thorne, who caught it with trembling hands. He opened it, his eyes widening in horror as he saw the miniature portrait. It was not their mother's face. It was Clara's. If you cooperate, Major, the agent said, his voice smooth and menacing, we'll ensure that your niece remains unharmed. If you don't, he shrugged, leaving the threat unspoken. Thorne looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of despair and apology. He knew what he had to do. He had to protect her, even if it meant betraying everything he believed in. All right, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I'll tell you what you want to know. The agent nodded, satisfied.
Good.
Now, about Nightingale. As Thorne began to speak, fabricating a story, a lie designed to protect Clara and mislead the agents, Clara's mind raced. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch as Thorne sacrificed himself, as Thomas remained trapped in that endless nightmare. She noticed a heavy iron poker leaning against the fireplace. It was her only weapon, her only chance. She waited for the right moment, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clammy with sweat. As the agent was distracted, listening to Thorne's fabricated confession, Clara moved. With a speed and strength she didn't know she possessed, she grabbed the poker and swung it with all her might, striking the agent holding the locket on the back of the head. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The other agent turned, his eyes widening in surprise and anger. He reached for his gun, but Thorne, galvanized by Clara's actions, tackled him, sending them both crashing to the floor. "Run, Clara!" Thorne shouted.
Run.
Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the locket from the floor, snatched a handful of papers from Thorne's desk, his original Nightingale files. She hoped and fled out the front door, into the overgrown garden, into the darkness. She ran blindly, her lungs burning, her heart pounding, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind her. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stop. She had to escape, to protect the evidence, to find a way to save Thomas, to expose the truth. She stumbled, falling to her knees, scraping her hands and knees on the rough ground. She looked back, her breath catching in her throat. The agents were gaining on her. Suddenly, a hand reached out from the shadows, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. It was a woman, dressed in the uniform of a VAD nurse, her face pale but determined. "Come with me," the woman whispered. "I can help you." Clara didn't know who she was, but she had no choice. She followed the woman, trusting in the desperate hope that she had found an ally, a friend in a world of enemies. As they disappeared into the darkness, Clara clutched the locket and the papers, her only links to Thomas, her only weapons against the powerful forces arrayed against her. The crumpled letter, pulled from the pile with the files, felt heavy in her hand. It was addressed, simply, in faded ink, to be opened in the event of my capture or disappearance, J. Thorne. Chapter 7. Scars of the Heart. The VAD nurse, whose name was Evelyn Davies, led Clara through a maze of back alleys and hidden pathways, eventually reaching a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of the village. It was a safe house, she explained, used by a network of individuals who were resisting the official narrative of the war, who were seeking the truth behind the lies and betrayals. "We know about you, Mrs. Ainsworth," Evelyn said, as she bandaged Clara's scraped hands. "We know about your brother. And we know about Major Thorne." Clara looked at her, surprised and relieved. How did you know?"
Evelyn smiled. A sad, knowing smile.
"We have our sources. We've been watching Thorne for some time. We knew he was in danger. We weren't sure when they would move against him." Who are they?" Clara asked. "They call themselves the Inner Circle," Evelyn explained. "A group of powerful men within the government, within the military, within the intelligence services. They're the ones who control the narrative, who manipulate events, who silence anyone who threatens their power." "Lord Harrington?" Clara whispered. Evelyn nodded.
"He's one of them."
"The leader, perhaps. But there are others. Just as powerful, just as ruthless." Clara felt a surge of anger, of frustration. "How can we fight them? They're everywhere." "We fight them with information," Evelyn said. "With the truth. We expose their lies, their betrayals, their crimes. We awaken the people." She handed Clara a cup of strong, sweet tea. "Rest now, Mrs. Ainsworth. You're safe here. We'll figure out what to do next." Clara sipped the tea, her mind racing. She had the locket, and she had Thorne's letter. She opened the letter, her hands trembling. The handwriting was small and cramped, but legible. "My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, I assume the worst. I have discovered the truth about Nightingale, and it is more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. It is not just a matter of espionage, it is a deliberate manipulation of the war itself. Lord Harrington and his inner circle are not simply passing information to the Germans, they are actively prolonging the conflict, sacrificing countless lives for their own twisted ends. They are using a technology, a device, that allows them to influence events, to alter the course of battles, to create pockets of distorted time. The mirror you possess is one such device, a receiver, tuned to the frequency of Passchendaele, the site of their greatest experiment. To break the cycle, you must find the source, the transmitter. It is located the next few lines were smudged, illegible, destroy it, and you will free your brother and the others from their endless torment. But be warned, Clara. They will stop at nothing to protect their secret. Trust no one, except perhaps for Evelyn Davies. She is one of us. Godspeed. Julian Thorne. Clara stared at the letter, her heart pounding. Thorne's words confirmed her worst fears. It wasn't just a conspiracy, it was a monstrous, inhuman manipulation of time and space, of life and death. She looked at Evelyn, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and determination.
We have to find the transmitter, she said.
We have to destroy it. Evelyn nodded. We will. But it won't be easy. The inner circle is powerful, well connected, and they have eyes everywhere.
She paused.
The smudged part, I think I know where Thorne might have hidden a more complete explanation. He had a habit of leaving messages in books. He loved the library, the one near his cottage. Clara felt a flicker of hope. A new lead, a new chance. But the words "trust no one" echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. The physical scars on her hands were nothing compared to the emotional scars the war and this new knowledge were inflicting on her heart. But she would endure. For Thomas. For Thorne. For all the lost souls trapped in the endless echo of Passchendaele. Chapter 8. Beneath a London Sky. The journey back to London was fraught with tension. Every passing car, every stranger's glance, seemed to hold a potential threat. Evelyn, with her quiet efficiency and knowledge of the city's hidden pathways, guided Clara through the back streets and alleyways, avoiding the main thoroughfares where they might be recognized. They arrived in London under the cover of darkness, the city shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to mirror the uncertainty and danger that surrounded them. Evelyn led Clara to another safe house, this one located in a bustling, working-class neighborhood, a place where strangers were common and anonymity was a way of life. We'll be safe here for a while, Evelyn said, as she unlocked the door to a small, sparsely furnished flat above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread, warm and comforting, filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold fear that gripped Clara's heart. The library, Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. Thorne mentioned a library near his cottage. We need to go there. Evelyn nodded. I know the one. It's small, but Thorne frequented it. He had a fondness for old books, for hidden knowledge. They decided to wait until morning, to approach the library during daylight hours, when they would be less conspicuous. Clara tried to rest, but sleep eluded her. Her mind was a whirlwind of images and thoughts: Thomas's face in the mirror, Thorne's desperate warning, the menacing faces of the inner circle agents. She clutched Thomas's locket, the cold metal a small comfort against her skin. She opened it, gazing at the miniature portrait of herself, the image that had replaced her mother's. It was a chilling reminder of the power the inner circle wielded, their ability to reach across worlds, to manipulate even the smallest details of their lives. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the grimy window of the flat, Clara felt a surge of determination. She would not be defeated. She would not let fear paralyze her. She would find the transmitter, expose the truth, and save her brother. They reached the library shortly after it opened, blending in with the handful of early morning readers. It was a small, unassuming building, filled with the comforting scent of old paper and leather. Clara felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had been there before, perhaps in a dream. Evelyn, who had worked as a librarian before the war, took the lead, navigating the shelves with ease. Thorne had a particular interest in esoteric subjects, she said, her voice low. Alchemy, ancient history, forgotten languages. They searched for hours, poring over dusty tomes, searching for any clue, any hidden message that Thorne might have left behind. Clara felt a growing sense of frustration, of despair. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack, a single grain of truth in a mountain of information. Just as she was about to give up, Evelyn let out a soft gasp. I think I found something. She was standing in front of a shelf filled with books on ancient Egypt, a subject that had always fascinated Thorne, according to his letter. She pulled out a large, leather-bound volume, its title barely legible, The Secrets of Thoth. She opened the book carefully, her fingers tracing the faded hieroglyphs and intricate drawings. And then she saw it, a small, folded piece of paper, tucked between the pages. She unfolded the paper, her hands trembling. It was a map, a detailed map of a location Clara didn't recognize. But there were markings, symbols, and a single word, written in Thorne's familiar handwriting, transmitter. And below it, a more detailed location, beneath the old observatory, Greenwich. Clara felt a surge of adrenaline, of hope mixed with fear. They had found it, the location of the transmitter. But it was in Greenwich, beneath the Royal Observatory, a place that would be heavily guarded, a place where they would be walking into the lion's den. The London sky outside, clearing from the fog, seemed to offer a silent promise of both hope and imminent danger. Chapter 9. The Hospital of Lost Souls. Before they could make their way to Greenwich, Evelyn insisted on a detour. There's someone you need to meet, she said, her voice firm. Someone who can help us. Someone who knows more about these devices than anyone else. She led Clara to a large, imposing building in the heart of London, a military hospital, still overflowing with the wounded and the traumatized from the war. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and despair, the sounds of suffering echoing through the long, sterile corridors. This is not what I expected, Clara said, her voice trembling. Evelyn nodded. This is where the forgotten soldiers end up. The ones who saw too much, who experienced things beyond comprehension. The ones the army wants to keep quiet. She led Clara through a maze of wards, past rows of beds filled with men bearing the physical and mental scars of war. Some were missing limbs. Others were blind. Others were simply lost, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. They reached a small, secluded room at the end of a long corridor. The door was locked, and a guard stood outside, his face impassive. Evelyn spoke to the guard in hushed tones, showing him a small, silver badge, the symbol of their resistance network. The guard nodded, his expression softening slightly, and unlocked the door. Inside the room, a man sat on a narrow bed, his back to the door. He was dressed in a hospital gown, his hair long and unkempt, his body thin and frail. He was staring at the wall, his eyes vacant, his mind seemingly a million miles away. Captain Davies? Evelyn said softly. The man turned, his eyes slowly focusing on Evelyn, then on Clara. He was young, surprisingly young, but his eyes held the same haunted look that Clara had seen in Thomas's, in Thorne's, in the eyes of all the men trapped in the endless cycle of the war. Evelyn, he said, his voice a raspy whisper. You shouldn't be here. It's dangerous. We need your help, Captain, Evelyn said. This is Clara Ainsworth. Her brother, he's trapped. In Passchendaele. Captain Davies looked at Clara, his eyes widening slightly. The mirror, he whispered. You've seen it? Clara nodded. Yes. And I know about the transmitter. We need to destroy it. Captain Davies leaned forward, his gaze intense. You understand what that means? You understand the risks? I understand that my brother is suffering, Clara said, her voice firm. And I'll do anything to save him. Captain Davies studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. I can help you. I know the technology. I was part of the project. Before they used it on us. He explained, in halting, fragmented sentences, the workings of the transmitter, the science behind the manipulation of time and space. It was complex, bewildering, but Clara grasped the essential elements. The transmitter, he explained, was powered by a rare element, a substance found only in a few remote locations around the world. This element, when subjected to a specific frequency of energy, created a distortion in the fabric of reality, a ripple that could be used to alter events, to create pockets of trapped time. They used it to prolong the war, he said, his voice filled with bitterness. To test their theories. To control the outcome. But why Passchendaele? Clara asked. Captain Davies shook his head. It was a perfect storm. The sheer scale of the carnage. The concentration of energy. The psychic trauma. It created a vortex. A feedback loop. That's why they're trapped there. Reliving the same battle, over and over again. He paused, then added, the transmitter, it's heavily guarded. Protected by layers of security. But there's a weakness. A vulnerability. The energy source, it's unstable. If you can disrupt the flow of energy, you can overload the system. Cause it to collapse. He gave Clara a small, metal device, about the size of a pocket watch. This will disrupt the frequency. It's a jamming device. Get it close to the transmitter. Activate it.
And run.
Clara took the device, her hand trembling. It was a small, fragile thing, but it represented her only hope, her only chance to save Thomas, to break the cycle of endless suffering. As they left the hospital, the weight of the information, the desperation of the lost souls within, pressed down on Clara. She had seen the true cost of the war, the hidden wounds that festered beneath the surface of victory. And she was more determined than ever to fight for a future where such horrors would never be repeated. She glanced back at the imposing building, a monument to suffering, and knew that the battle ahead was not just for her brother, but for all the forgotten victims of the inner circle's monstrous ambition. Chapter 10. Two Sides of the Mirror. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich loomed before them, a majestic building perched atop a hill overlooking the City of London. It was a symbol of scientific progress, of human knowledge and understanding, yet beneath its surface, beneath its gleaming domes and intricate instruments, lay a dark secret, a monstrous perversion of science. Clara and Evelyn approached the observatory cautiously, blending in with the tourists and visitors who were admiring the view, the historic buildings, the famous Meridian Line. They knew they were walking into a trap, that the inner circle would be expecting them, but they had no choice. They had to reach the transmitter, to destroy it, to save Thomas. They followed the map that Thorne had hidden in the secrets of Thoth, navigating the winding paths and hidden corridors beneath the observatory. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive, as they descended deeper into the earth. They could feel the hum of energy, the subtle vibration of the transmitter, growing stronger with each step. They reached a large, steel door, guarded by two men in dark uniforms. The men were armed, their faces impassive, their eyes scanning the surroundings with cold efficiency. "This is it," Evelyn whispered. The entrance to the transmitter chamber. Clara looked at the guards, her heart pounding. They couldn't fight their way through. They needed a distraction, a way to bypass the security. She remembered the jamming device that Captain Davies had given her. It was designed to disrupt electronic systems, to create a temporary blackout. It might be enough to disable the security cameras, the alarms, the electronic locks on the door. "I have an idea," she whispered to Evelyn. "But it's risky." She explained her plan, her voice low and urgent. Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. "It's our only chance," she said. Clara took a deep breath, stepped out into the open, and approached the guards. She feigned confusion, asking them for directions, pretending to be a lost tourist. As they were distracted, explaining the layout of the observatory, Evelyn slipped past them, unnoticed, and reached the steel door. She quickly placed the jamming device on the door's electronic lock, activated it, and stepped back. There was a brief, high-pitched whine, a flicker of the lights, and then silence. The electronic lock clicked open. Evelyn pulled the door open, and they slipped inside, into the darkness beyond. They found themselves in a large, circular chamber, filled with strange, humming machinery. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and electricity, the vibration of the transmitter almost palpable. In the center of the chamber, a large, crystal-like structure pulsed with an eerie, blue light. This was it, the transmitter, the source of the distorted time, the source of Thomas's endless suffering. As they approached the transmitter, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was Lord Harrington, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes burning with a cold, fanatic light. "So," he said, his voice smooth and menacing, "you've come to play the hero, Mrs. Ainsworth." Clara stood her ground, her hand clutching the locket, her gaze fixed on Harrington. "I've come to stop you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I've come to end this madness." Harrington smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "You can't stop progress, Mrs. Ainsworth. You can't stop the future." "This isn't progress," Clara said, her voice filled with anger and disgust. "This is an abomination. You're sacrificing innocent lives for your own twisted ambitions." "Sacrifices must be made," Harrington said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "For the greater good." He gestured to the transmitter. This is the future, Mrs. Ainsworth. The power to control time, to control history, to control everything." He raised his hand, and two more figures stepped out from the shadows. They were the agents who had attacked Thorne's cottage, their faces bruised and bandaged, but their eyes still filled with a cold, murderous intent. "Take them," Harrington ordered. The agents advanced on Clara and Evelyn, their hands reaching for their weapons. Clara knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, but she wouldn't give up. She wouldn't surrender. Suddenly, the mirror in her pocket began to vibrate, to glow with an intense, white light. She pulled it out, her hand trembling. The image of the muddy trench, of Passchendaele, appeared in the glass. And then she saw him, Thomas, standing in the trench, his face determined, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering resolve. He was holding a rifle, his finger on the trigger. "Clara," he shouted, his voice echoing across the two worlds.
Now.
At that moment, on opposite sides of a fractured reality, Clara and Thomas acted. Clara hurled the now glowing mirror at the crystal transmitter, and Thomas fired his rifle, aiming not at an enemy soldier, but at the reflection of the transmitter in the glass. The bullet, fired in the past, impacted the present as the mirror shattered against the crystal, unleashing a blinding flash of energy, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the observatory. The two sides of the mirror, past and present, collided in a cataclysmic explosion of light and sound. Chapter 11. Duty's Cruel Hand. The explosion threw Clara and Evelyn to the ground, shielding their eyes from the blinding light. The chamber filled with smoke and the acrid smell of burning metal. The humming of the transmitter ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. When Clara could see again, she looked around, her heart pounding. The crystal structure was shattered, its fragments scattered across the floor. The agents were gone, vanished. Lord Harrington lay on the ground, unconscious, his face pale and lifeless. But the mirror was gone. And with it, the image of Thomas, of Passchendaele. "Thomas!" Clara cried, her voice filled with despair. "Thomas!" She scrambled to her feet, searching frantically for any sign of the mirror, any sign of her brother. But there was nothing. Just the wreckage of the transmitter, the silence of the chamber, the crushing weight of her loss. Evelyn placed a hand on her shoulder, her eyes filled with sympathy. "He's gone, Clara," she said softly. "The cycle it's broken." Broken. The word echoed in Clara's mind. Yes, the cycle was broken. But at what cost? Thomas was free from the endless battle, but he was also gone. Lost forever. She sank to her knees, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. She had saved him, but she had also lost him. The victory felt hollow, empty, a bitter triumph in the face of unbearable sorrow. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her arm, a strong, firm grip. She looked up, her eyes widening in disbelief. Standing before her, his uniform muddy and tattered, his face gaunt but familiar, was Thomas. "Clara," he said, his voice choked with emotion. It's really you." Clara stared at him, her mind reeling. It couldn't be. It was impossible. And yet there he was. Real, solid, alive. She threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly, tears of joy and relief streaming down her face.
Thomas.
You're alive. You're here. He held her close, his body trembling.
I don't understand, he said.
One moment I was there. In the trench. And then there was a blinding light. And I was here. He looked around the chamber, his eyes widening in confusion. Where are we? Clara explained, her voice still trembling with emotion, about the transmitter, about the inner circle, about Lord Harrington, about everything that had happened. Thomas listened intently, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and horror. So it was all a lie?
He said.
The war Passchendaele, it was manipulated? Clara nodded. Yes. But it's over now. You're free. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. And Captain Wakefield? The others? Clara hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. I hope they're free, too. As they stood there, embracing, the sound of sirens filled the air. The authorities were arriving, alerted by the explosion. Clara knew they would have to face questions, explanations, perhaps even accusations. But for now, for this brief moment, she didn't care. She had her brother back.
That was all that mattered.
But as the sirens grew closer, a figure emerged from the shadows, slowly approaching them. It was Major Thorne, looking surprisingly well, considering his ordeal. He stopped before them, a sad smile on his face. I'm afraid, he said, his voice gentle but firm, that duty still calls, Private Ainsworth. The war may be over for you in one sense, but he gestured towards the wreckage of the transmitter. This changes everything. Your unique experience, your knowledge, it's invaluable. Clara felt a chill run down her spine.
Duty.
The word that had haunted her family for generations, the word that had taken her father, her brother, and now, it seemed, was about to claim Thomas again. But this time, it wasn't the duty of the battlefield, but a different kind of service, a different kind of war, fought in the shadows, against an enemy that was even more insidious, even more dangerous. The cruel hand of duty, it seemed, was far from finished with the Ainsworth family. Chapter 12. The Spy Among Us. Thorne's words hung in the air, a stark reminder that the battle was far from over. While Thomas had escaped the endless loop of Passchendaele, he was now thrust into a new, more clandestine conflict. The knowledge he gained, the experience he endured, made him a valuable asset, but also a target. What does that mean? Thomas asked, his voice filled with apprehension. What kind of duty? Thorne explained that the government, or at least a faction within it, was aware of the inner circle's activities, of the time manipulation technology. They needed someone with first-hand experience, someone who could help them understand the technology, to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands, to counter its potential use by other nations. You've seen things, Private Ainsworth, Thorne said. Things that no one else has. You understand the nuances, the dangers. You can help us prevent this from ever happening again. Clara felt a surge of anger, of protectiveness. He's been through enough, she said, her voice trembling. He deserves to live a normal life. Thorne nodded sympathetically. I understand, Mrs. Ainsworth. But this is bigger than any one of us. This is about the future. About preventing another war, a war that could be even more devastating than the last. Thomas looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a mixture of conflict and resolve. He knew what he had to do. He had a duty, not just to his country, but to humanity, to prevent the horrors he had witnessed from ever being repeated. I'll do it, he said, his voice firm. I'll help you. Clara knew she couldn't stop him. She saw the determination in his eyes, the same determination that had led him to enlist in the first place, the same determination that had sustained him through the endless nightmare of Passchendaele. The authorities arrived, a flurry of activity and confusion. Clara and Thomas were taken into custody, questioned for hours, their story met with skepticism and disbelief. But Thorne, with his connections and his knowledge, managed to vouch for them, to convince the authorities that they were telling the truth, that they were valuable assets, not enemies. They were released but not freed. They were placed under surveillance, their movements monitored, their lives controlled. They were, in effect, prisoners of a different kind, trapped in a world of secrecy and intrigue. Evelyn, who had disappeared after the explosion, resurfaced, revealing that she was part of a secret intelligence unit tasked with investigating the inner circle and its activities. She became their liaison, their protector, their guide in this new, dangerous world. "We're walking a tightrope," Evelyn warned them. "We have to be careful. The inner circle may be weakened, but they're not defeated. They still have allies, resources, influence." Clara, despite her initial reluctance, found herself drawn into this new conflict. She couldn't stand idly by while Thomas risked his life, while the world remained at risk. She used her research skills, her knowledge of the War Office, her connections, to help Evelyn gather information, to uncover the remaining members of the inner circle, to expose their activities. One evening, as they were working late in Evelyn's safe house, poring over files and documents, Clara noticed a familiar name. A name that had appeared repeatedly in Thorne's investigation, a name that had been dismissed as irrelevant, a name that now sent a chill down her spine. "Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling. "Look at this." She pointed to a document, report on a meeting between Lord Harrington and several other high-ranking officials. Among the names listed was Captain Alistair Wakefield. Evelyn stared at the document, her eyes widening in disbelief. Wakefield? But he was trapped in Passchendaele, with Thomas. Clara shook her head. "That's what we thought. But what if he wasn't? What if he was part of it all along? A double agent?" The implications were staggering. Wakefield, the man who had seemed so determined to break the cycle, the man who had guided them, who had provided them with information, could he have been playing them all along? Could he have been working for the inner circle? Clara remembered Wakefield's words, his insistence that there was a traitor, his focus on Nightingale. Was it all a smokescreen, a distraction to divert attention from himself? The chilling realization settled upon her like a shroud. They had trusted him. They had confided in him. And he had betrayed them. The spy, it seemed, had been among them all along, hiding in plain sight, reflected in the very mirror that had brought them together. The enemy wasn't just a shadowy organization, it was someone they believed to be an ally. Chapter 13. A Dance of Deception. The revelation that Captain Wakefield might be a double agent cast a long shadow over their efforts. Every piece of information he had provided, every strategy they had discussed, now had to be re-evaluated, scrutinized for hidden motives, for potential traps. "We can't trust anything he told us," Clara said, her voice filled with frustration and anger. "We have to assume he was playing us from the beginning." Evelyn nodded grimly. It's a bitter pill to swallow. But we have to face the facts. Wakefield was in a position to manipulate events, to control the flow of information. He could have been orchestrating the entire thing. Thomas, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal.
"But why? He seemed so genuine.
So determined to escape." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with sympathy. He was a good actor, Thomas. He played his part perfectly. He fooled us all. They decided to keep their suspicions about Wakefield to themselves, to avoid alerting him, to give themselves time to gather more evidence, to understand his motives, to plan their next move. They continued their investigation, focusing on the remaining members of the inner circle, on uncovering their network, their resources, their plans. They discovered that the inner circle's ambitions extended far beyond the war, that they were seeking to use the time manipulation technology to reshape the world, to create a new order, a new world dominated by their ideology. They also discovered that Wakefield was not the only double agent within their ranks. There were others, placed strategically within the government, within the military, within the intelligence services. The inner circle's reach was far wider, far deeper than they had initially imagined. One evening, Evelyn received a coded message, a summons to a meeting with a high-ranking official, someone who claimed to have information about the inner circle, someone who wanted to defect. It could be a trap, Clara warned. It could be Wakefield. Evelyn nodded.
"I know.
But we have to take the risk. We need inside information. We need to know what they're planning." They decided that Evelyn would attend the meeting, but with backup. Clara and Thomas would remain hidden, nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. They would use the jamming device, modified by Captain Davies, to disable any electronic surveillance, to give themselves an advantage. The meeting was scheduled to take place in a deserted warehouse, near the docks, a place where secrets were often exchanged, where deals were made, where lives were sometimes lost. Evelyn arrived at the warehouse, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. The interior was dark and cavernous, filled with the shadows of crates and machinery. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering glow. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man in a dark suit. It was not Wakefield. It was Sir Reginald Fairbanks, the Minister of War. "Miss Davies," Fairbanks said, his voice smooth and cultured. "Thank you for coming." Evelyn studied him, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "You said you had information about the inner circle." Fairbanks nodded. "I do. I've been investigating them for some time. I know their plans, their ambitions, and I want to stop them." He explained that he had been a member of the inner circle, but that he had become disillusioned, horrified by their methods, by their goals. He wanted to defect, to help them expose the inner circle, to bring them to justice. He provided Evelyn with a wealth of information, names, dates, locations, details of the inner circle's operations, their plans for the future. It was a treasure trove of intelligence, exactly what they needed. But as Fairbanks was speaking, Clara, who was monitoring the situation from a nearby rooftop, using a pair of binoculars, noticed something. A flicker of movement in the shadows, a glint of metal. She zoomed in, her heart pounding. It was Wakefield. He was hiding in the rafters, above the warehouse, a sniper rifle in his hands. He was aiming at Fairbanks. Clara realized, with a sickening certainty, that the meeting was a setup, a trap. Not for Evelyn, but for Fairbanks. Wakefield was there to silence him, to prevent him from revealing the inner circle's secrets. The dance of deception was far from over. The betrayer was about to betray the betrayed. And Clara was the only one who could stop him. Chapter 14.
Stolen moments, shattered drams.
Clara knew she had to act quickly. She grabbed the modified jamming device, activated it, and raced down from the rooftop, towards the warehouse. The device, she hoped, would disrupt Wakefield's communication, his ability to coordinate with any other inner circle agents. She burst through the warehouse door, shouting a warning. "Evelyn! It's a trap! Wakefield, he's here!" Evelyn, startled by Clara's sudden appearance, turned towards her, her eyes widening in alarm. Fairbanks, realizing that he had been exposed, reached for a gun hidden beneath his coat. But Wakefield was faster. A shot rang out, echoing through the cavernous warehouse. Fairbanks crumpled to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Wakefield, from his perch in the rafters, lowered his rifle, a smug smile on his face. "So," he said, his voice amplified by the warehouse's acoustics, "the little bird has flown the coop." He aimed his rifle at Evelyn, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Thomas, who had been hidden behind a stack of crates, tackled him from behind, sending them both crashing to the ground. A fierce struggle ensued, a brutal fight between two men who had once been comrades, who had once shared the same nightmare, but who were now sworn enemies. Clara rushed to Evelyn's side, helping her to her feet. "Are you all right?" Evelyn nodded, her face pale but determined. "Yes." But Fairbanks, they knelt beside Fairbanks, his lifeblood staining the concrete floor. He was still alive, but barely. To the transmitter he gasped, his voice weak. "They're rebuilding it." A new location, he tried to speak, to reveal the location, but his strength failed him. He closed his eyes, his body going limp. He was gone. Clara felt a surge of grief, of frustration. They had lost another ally, another source of information. And Wakefield, he was still out there. The fight between Thomas and Wakefield continued, a desperate struggle for survival. Wakefield, despite his age, was strong and agile, a trained killer. He managed to break free from Thomas's grasp, grabbing his rifle and aiming it at him. But before he could fire, Clara intervened. She picked up Fairbanks's discarded gun, her hand trembling, and pointed it at Wakefield. "Drop it, Wakefield," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's over." Wakefield looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and contempt. You're going to shoot me?" "I'll do whatever it takes," Clara said, her finger tightening on the trigger.
To stop you.
"To stop the inner circle." He hesitated for a moment, then slowly lowered his rifle. He knew he was defeated. He had underestimated Clara, underestimated her determination, her courage. The authorities arrived, alerted by the gunshot. Wakefield was taken into custody, his reign of terror finally over. But the victory felt bittersweet. Fairbanks was dead, the location of the new transmitter remained a mystery, and the inner circle, though weakened, was still at large. As they left the warehouse, the city lights twinkling around them, Clara felt a profound sense of exhaustion, of disillusionment. The war, it seemed, had taken everything from her. Her family, her friends, her innocence, her dreams. Thomas placed a comforting arm around her. "We'll find them, Clara," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "We'll stop them."
We have to.
She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and despair. She knew he was right. They had to keep fighting. But the cost was almost unbearable. The stolen moments of peace, of hope, were shattered by the harsh realities of their ongoing struggle. The dream of a normal life, of a future free from fear and conflict, seemed further away than ever. The warehouse stood silent behind them, a tomb of yet another broken promise, another casualty in a war that refused to end. Chapter 15. The Reckoning of Truth. Wakefield's capture, while a significant victory, provided little solace. He refused to cooperate, remaining stubbornly silent, his secrets locked away behind a wall of defiance and carefully constructed lies. The location of the new transmitter, the identities of the remaining Inner Circle members, remained elusive. Clara, Evelyn, and Thomas, along with a small, trusted team assembled by Thorne, worked tirelessly, sifting through the evidence, following every lead, however tenuous. They were racing against time, knowing that the Inner Circle was rebuilding, regrouping, preparing to unleash their time manipulation technology once again. They focused their efforts on Fairbanks's last words, his desperate attempt to reveal the location of the new transmitter. "They're rebuilding it." A new location, he had tried to say more, but death had silenced him. Clara remembered Thorne's letter, his mention of a hidden message, a more complete explanation of his findings. He had hidden it in the library, in the secrets of Thoth. But the map they had found there only led them to the destroyed transmitter beneath the Greenwich Observatory. She realized, with a sudden flash of insight, that there might be another message, another layer of concealment. Thorne, knowing the risks, had likely created multiple layers of security, a series of clues, each leading to the next. She returned to the library, to the Secrets of Thoth, the book that had already yielded one crucial clue. She examined it carefully, turning every page, searching for any hidden compartments, any secret markings, any sign of a further message. And then she found it, a small, almost invisible inscription, etched into the inside cover of the book, near the spine. It was a series of numbers, a code. She recognized the code instantly. It was a simple substitution cipher, one that Thorne had often used in his correspondence. She quickly deciphered the message. It read, "Stonehenge. Beneath the altar stone." Stonehenge. The ancient monument, a place of mystery and power, a place steeped in history and legend. It made a terrible kind of sense. The Inner Circle, with their obsession with ancient knowledge, with their twisted ideology, would choose such a location. A place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the energies of the earth converged. Clara shared her discovery with Evelyn and Thomas. They knew that this was it. The final confrontation. The reckoning of truth. They prepared for their mission, gathering their resources, assembling their team. Captain Davies, recovered from his ordeal, provided them with a more powerful jamming device, one designed to disrupt the larger, more sophisticated transmitter they expected to find at Stonehenge. They traveled to Stonehenge under the cover of darkness, the ancient stones looming before them, silhouetted against the night sky. The air was cold and still, filled with an eerie silence, a sense of anticipation, of impending danger. They located the altar stone, a massive, flat slab of rock at the center of the circle. Beneath it, hidden from view, was a narrow, stone-lined passage leading down into the earth. They descended into the passage, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive, as they went deeper and deeper. They could feel the hum of energy, the subtle vibration of the transmitter, growing stronger with each step. They reached a large, underground chamber, illuminated by an eerie, blue light. In the center of the chamber, a massive, complex machine pulsed with energy. It was the new transmitter, even larger and more powerful than the one they had destroyed at Greenwich. And standing before it, surrounded by a group of armed guards, was the leader of the inner circle. Not Lord Harrington, who was still in a coma, but someone they had never suspected. It was Major Julian Thorne. Clara stared at him, her mind reeling.
It couldn't be.
Thorne, their ally, their guide, the man who had seemed so dedicated to exposing the inner circle, he was the leader? Thorne smiled, a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. "Surprised, Mrs. Ainsworth?" he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Did you really think I was so easily fooled? Did you really believe my fabricated story?" The truth, stark and brutal, crashed down upon her. Thorne had played them all. He had used them, manipulated them, led them on a wild goose chase, while he continued his work, his plan to reshape the world, to control time itself. The reckoning, it seemed, was not just about the inner circle, but about the deepest betrayal of all. Chapter 16. Letters from the Front.
You.
Clara stammered, her voice choked with disbelief and betrayal.
But.
Your letter. The Nightingale investigation. Everything. Thorne chuckled, a low, chilling sound. The letter was a masterpiece, wasn't it? A perfect blend of truth and fiction. Enough truth to make it believable, enough fiction to mislead you. Nightingale was real, a convenient scapegoat. Harrington was a useful pawn, ambitious, but ultimately foolish. I used them both. He gestured to the massive transmitter. This is my creation, Mrs. Ainsworth. My masterpiece. With this, I can control time, rewrite history, create a world free from the chaos and imperfections of the present. Thomas stepped forward, his face filled with anger. You're insane, Thorne. You're playing God. You're destroying lives. Thorne shrugged. Collateral damage, Private Ainsworth. Necessary sacrifices for the greater good. You of all people should understand that. You've seen the horrors of war. I'm offering a solution. A world without war, without suffering, without death. By trapping people in endless nightmares? Clara challenged, her voice trembling. By manipulating time? By distorting reality? A small price to pay, Thorne said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. For a perfect world. Evelyn stepped forward, her hand on the jamming device. We won't let you do this, Thorne. We'll stop you. Thorne smiled. You? And what a handful of soldiers, and a grieving widow. You're no match for me.
For this.
He raised his hand, and the guards surrounding the transmitter aimed their weapons at Clara, Evelyn, and Thomas. It's over, Thorne said. Your little game is finished. Clara looked at Thomas, at Evelyn, her eyes filled with despair. They were trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. It seemed hopeless. Suddenly, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of letters. They were old, faded letters, tied together with a piece of string. Letters from the front. Letters he had written to Clara during the war. You said you wanted a world without death, Thorne, Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. But death is part of life. It's what makes life precious. It's what gives meaning to our moments of joy, our moments of love, our moments of connection. He held up the letters. These are the letters I wrote to Clara. From the trenches. From hell. They're filled with fear, with despair, with the horrors of war. But they're also filled with hope, with love, with the memories of home, of family, of a life worth fighting for. He began to read, his voice trembling with emotion, excerpts from his letters. Letters describing the mud, the blood, the death, but also the camaraderie, the courage, the fleeting moments of beauty amidst the devastation. Letters expressing his love for Clara, his longing for home, his dreams of a future that he might never see. As Thomas read, Clara felt tears streaming down her face. She remembered those letters, how she had clung to them, how they had been her lifeline, her connection to her brother, her only source of hope during those dark days. She looked at Thorn, at the guards, and she saw a flicker of emotion in their eyes. A flicker of doubt, of uncertainty, of humanity. Thomas's words, his memories, his love, were reaching them, touching them, reminding them of what they were fighting for, of what they were risking, of what they were about to destroy. The simple, heartfelt words from a soldier's letters were proving to be a more powerful weapon than any gun, any technology, any twisted ideology. The letters, filled with the raw emotion of life and loss, were beginning to crack the foundation of Thorn's meticulously constructed world. Chapter 17. The Edge of Despair. As Thomas continued to read, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted. The guards, initially stoic and unwavering, began to show signs of unease. Some lowered their weapons lightly, their gazes shifting from Clara and her companions to Thorn, their expressions questioning, uncertain. Thorn, however, remained unmoved, his face a mask of cold determination. Sentimentality, he sneered. A weakness.
A flaw in your human design.
He raised his hand again, signaling the guards to resume their positions. Enough of this. It's time to end this charade. But before the guards could react, one of them stepped forward, his rifle lowered. No, he said, his voice trembling but firm. I won't do it.
I won't be a part of this.
Another guard followed suit, then another and another. Soon, most of the guards had lowered their weapons, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, guilt, and defiance. Thorn stared at them, his eyes widening in disbelief. What is the meaning of this? He demanded. You dare to disobey me? We're not your puppets, Thorn, one of the guards said. We're soldiers. We swore an oath to protect our country, not to destroy it. Thorn, realizing that he had lost control, that his carefully constructed plan was unraveling, lunged towards the transmitter, his hand reaching for the controls. I'll do it myself, he shouted. I'll activate it. I'll show you all. But before he could reach the controls, Evelyn activated the jamming device. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber, followed by a series of sparks and explosions. The transmitter sputtered, flickered, and then went dark. Thorn stared at the inert machine, his face contorted in rage and despair.
No.
He screamed.
No.
It can't be. My perfect world. My destiny. He turned on Clara, Evelyn, and Thomas, his eyes filled with a murderous hatred. You did this. You ruined everything. He lunged at them, his hands outstretched, as if he could strangle them with his bare hands. But Thomas, reacting quickly, tackled him, wrestling him to the ground. A struggle ensued, a brief, violent confrontation. But Thorn, weakened by his obsession, by his madness, was no match for Thomas, who had fought in the trenches, who had faced death countless times. Thomas subdued Thorn, pinning him to the ground, his face inches from his. It's over, Thorn, he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and pity. It's finally over. The authorities, alerted by the disruption caused by the jamming device, arrived, taking Thorn and the remaining guards into custody. The transmitter was secured, its threat neutralized. As Clara, Evelyn, and Thomas emerged from the underground chamber into the cool night air, they felt a profound sense of relief, of exhaustion, of closure. The battle was over. The inner circle was defeated. The time manipulation technology was secured. But the victory was not without its scars. The betrayals, the losses, the horrors they had witnessed would stay with them forever. The edge of despair, the constant threat, had left an indelible mark. They had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. The world, though saved, felt fragile, uncertain, forever changed by the knowledge of what had almost been. Chapter 18. A Glimmer of Hope. The aftermath of the Stonehenge confrontation was a whirlwind of investigations, debriefings, and public revelations. The truth about the inner circle, about Thorne's machinations, about the time manipulation technology, was slowly, carefully, revealed to the world. The public reaction was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and outrage. The war, the Great War, the war that was supposed to end all wars, had been manipulated, prolonged, its horrors amplified by a group of power-hungry individuals seeking to reshape the world in their own twisted image. Thorne, along with the surviving members of the Inner Circle, was tried for treason, for crimes against humanity. The trials were lengthy, complex, and emotionally draining. Clara, Evelyn, and Thomas were called as witnesses, forced to relive the horrors they had experienced, to expose the betrayals they had endured. But amidst the darkness, amidst the pain and the loss, there were glimmers of hope. The world, shaken by the revelations, began to reevaluate its priorities, to question its assumptions, to seek a new path, a path towards peace, towards understanding, towards a future free from the manipulation and the madness of the past. Captain Davies, his expertise recognized and valued, was instrumental in developing safeguards, countermeasures to prevent the time manipulation technology from ever being used again. He became a symbol of redemption, of the possibility of healing, of the power of knowledge to overcome the forces of darkness. Evelyn, her courage and her intelligence finally acknowledged, was promoted within the intelligence services, tasked with leading a new unit, dedicated to identifying and neutralizing future threats, to ensuring that the secrets of the past would never again be used to endanger the future. Thomas, though haunted by his experiences, by the endless nightmare of Passchendaele, found a measure of peace, a sense of purpose, in helping Captain Davies, in using his unique knowledge to prevent others from suffering the same fate. He began to heal, to rebuild his life, to find a way to live with the scars of the past. Clara, too, began to heal. The grief for her brother, the initial, agonizing loss, was replaced by a different kind of grief, a grief for the world that had been, for the innocence that had been shattered, for the dreams that had been stolen. But she also found a new strength, a new determination. She had faced the darkness, she had stared into the abyss, and she had emerged, scarred but unbroken. She had fought for her brother, for her friends, for the future, and she had won. She continued her research, her writing, her advocacy for peace, for understanding, for a world free from the manipulation and the madness of war. She became a voice for the forgotten, for the victims, for all those who had suffered in silence. One evening, as she was sitting in her flat, the familiar scent of old paper and regret filling the air, she looked at the wall where the mirror had once hung. The space was empty now, a blank canvas, a reminder of the past, but also a symbol of the future. She had kept one fragment of the shattered mirror, a small, jagged piece of glass, a memento of her journey, of her brother, of the battle she had fought and won. She held it in her hand, feeling the smooth, cold surface, the sharp edges. She saw her reflection, her face, older now, lined with the experiences of the past few years, but her eyes held a new light, a light of resilience, of hope, of a future that was still uncertain, but that was, at least, free from the shadows of the past. The glimmer of hope, fragile yet persistent, shone brightly in her gaze. The war had changed her, but it had not broken her. Chapter 19. Beyond the reflection. Years passed. The world slowly recovered from the Great War, from the revelations of the Inner Circle's machinations. The scars remained, etched into the landscape, into the memories of those who had lived through it, but the healing process had begun. Clara continued her work, advocating for peace, for understanding, for a future where such horrors would never be repeated. She became a respected figure, a voice for reason, a symbol of resilience. Thomas, after his initial involvement with Captain Davies, decided to pursue a quieter life. The memories of Passchendaele, though faded, still haunted him, and he sought solace in the countryside, in the simple rhythms of nature. He married, had children, and found a measure of peace in a life far removed from the battlefields and the conspiracies that had once consumed him. Evelyn remained in the intelligence services, rising through the ranks, her expertise and her dedication earning her the respect and admiration of her colleagues. She never married, her life dedicated to protecting her country, to preventing future threats, to ensuring that the secrets of the past would remain buried. Clara and Evelyn remained close friends, their bond forged in the crucible of their shared experiences, their mutual respect and affection deepening over the years. They often met, sharing stories, reminiscing about the past, discussing the present, and hoping for a better future. One autumn afternoon, Clara visited Thomas at his cottage in the countryside. The air was crisp and cool, the leaves on the trees turning golden and red, the landscape bathed in the soft, warm light of the setting sun. They sat on the porch, sipping tea, watching Thomas's children play in the garden. The laughter of the children, innocent and carefree, filled the air, a stark contrast to the silence and the suffering that had once dominated their lives. "Do you ever think about it?" Thomas asked, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "About Passchendaele? About the mirror?" Clara nodded. "Sometimes," she said. "It's hard to forget. But it's also important to remember. To learn from the past. To prevent it from happening again." "I still have nightmares," Thomas admitted. "But they're less frequent now. Less vivid." He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me, Clara. You brought me back."
Clara smiled, a sad, knowing smile.
"We saved each other, Thomas. We helped each other through the darkness." They sat in silence for a while, watching the children play, listening to the sounds of the countryside, feeling the warmth of the setting sun on their faces. "I found something," Clara said, breaking the silence. In Thorne's files. After everything." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, faded photograph. It was a picture of Captain Alistair Wakefield, taken before the war. He was younger, his face unlined, his eyes filled with a bright, hopeful light. He wasn't always like that," Clara said, her voice trembling. He was a good man.
Once."
She explained that she had discovered, in Thorne's files, that Wakefield had been a victim of the time manipulation technology. He had been captured by the Germans, experimented on, his mind altered, his personality twisted. He had been turned into a weapon, a tool of the inner circle.
"Thorne, he used him," Clara said.
He destroyed him. He turned him into the very thing he hated." Thomas looked at the photograph, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and understanding.
He was a victim, too," he said.
Just like the rest of us." Clara nodded. "We were all victims in a way. Of the war, of the lies, of the manipulation. But we survived.
We fought back. And we won."
She looked at Thomas, at his children, at the peaceful landscape surrounding them. Beyond the reflection of the past, beyond the horrors they had endured, there was life, there was hope, there was a future worth fighting for. The scars remained, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders of their resilience, of their courage, of their ability to overcome even the darkest of times. The setting sun, casting long shadows across the fields, seemed to offer a silent blessing, a promise of peace after the storm. Chapter 20. The Price of Peace. Decades later, Clara sat in her armchair, the familiar weight of the fragmented mirror piece in her lap. Her hair was white, her hands gnarled with age, but her eyes still held that spark of resilience, that glimmer of hope that had carried her through so much. The world had changed dramatically since the days of the Great War, since the exposure of the inner circle. There had been other wars, other conflicts, other threats, but the lessons learned, the sacrifices made, had not been forgotten. The time manipulation technology remained secured, its secrets guarded, its potential for destruction neutralized. Clara had lived a long and full life, a life dedicated to peace, to understanding, to ensuring that the horrors of the past would never be repeated. She had written books, given lectures, advised governments, her voice a constant reminder of the fragility of peace, of the importance of vigilance, of the enduring power of the human spirit. Thomas had passed away peacefully several years earlier, surrounded by his family, his nightmares finally silenced, his heart at rest. Evelyn had died a few years before Thomas, her legacy enshrined in the intelligence services, her name whispered with respect and admiration. Clara was the last of the trio, the last surviving witness to the events that had unfolded in the aftermath of the Great War, the last guardian of the secrets of the mirror. She looked at the fragment of glass in her hand, the smooth, cold surface reflecting the light of the setting sun, casting a rainbow of colors on the wall. She remembered the muddy trenches of Passchendaele, the haunted eyes of the soldiers trapped in the endless cycle of battle, the chilling smile of Major Thorne, the desperate struggle to save her brother, to save the world. She remembered the faces of those they had lost, of Fairbanks, of Captain Davies, of countless others who had sacrificed their lives for the cause of peace. The price of peace, she knew, was high, a constant burden, a relentless struggle against the forces of darkness, against the temptations of power, against the enduring flaws of human nature.
But it was a price worth paying.
A price that had to be paid, again and again, generation after generation, to ensure that the future would be brighter, safer, more just than the past. She felt a sense of completion, of peace. She had done what she could. She had fought the good fight. She had kept the faith. She had honored the memory of those they had lost. She closed her eyes, the image of the mirror, of Passchendaele, of Thomas, of Evelyn, fading into the darkness, replaced by a sense of tranquility, of acceptance, of release. The setting sun cast a final, golden ray of light across the room, illuminating the empty space where the mirror had once hung, a space that was no longer empty, but filled with the memories, the lessons, the legacy of a life lived in service of peace. The fragment of glass slipped from her grasp, falling silently to the floor, its sharp edges no longer a threat, its reflection no longer a window to the past, but a reminder of the enduring power of hope, of love, of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of times. The price of peace had been paid, and Clara, at long last, was at rest. The final echoes of the war faded into a profound and lasting silence. Epilogue. The small cottage in Bloomsbury, once filled with the echoes of war and the whispers of a hidden world, stood silent and empty. Clara Ainsworth was gone, her long and extraordinary life having reached its peaceful end. The fragment of the mirror, the last tangible link to the events that had unfolded within those walls, lay on the floor, untouched, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. A young woman, a historian researching the Great War, entered the cottage. She had heard rumors of Clara Ainsworth, of a strange story involving a mirror, a lost brother, a secret conspiracy. She was skeptical, but intrigued. She wandered through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She saw the empty space on the wall where the mirror had once hung, a faint outline marking its presence. She felt a chill in the air, a sense of something she couldn't quite define. She noticed the fragment of glass on the floor, picking it up, examining it closely. It was just a piece of broken mirror, nothing more. And yet she felt a strange connection to it, a sense of history, of mystery, of something beyond her comprehension. She looked at her reflection in the fragment, her face young and hopeful, her eyes filled with the curiosity of a new generation, a generation that had grown up in a world shaped by the events of the past, a world that had learned, however imperfectly, the lessons of war and peace. She saw, not just her own reflection, but a glimpse of something else, something beyond the glass, something beyond the present. A flicker of movement, a hint of a landscape, a whisper of a voice. She blinked, shaking her head. It was just her imagination, she told herself. Just a trick of the light. But as she left the cottage, the fragment of the mirror safely tucked away in her pocket, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled onto something significant, something that connected her to the past, to the present, to the future. The legacy of Clara Ainsworth, of Thomas, of Evelyn, of all those who had fought for peace, lived on, not just in the history books, not just in the memories of those who had known them, but in the hearts and minds of a new generation, a generation that would continue the struggle, that would strive for a better world, a world free from the shadows of the past. The fragment of the mirror, a small, insignificant object, became a symbol of that legacy, a reminder of the enduring power of hope, of love, of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of times. The story was over, but the echoes remained, whispering across the years, a testament to the price of peace, an enduring promise of a brighter future.